Welcome to our Educational Diagnostician series. In this segment, we're going to be talking about issues related to effective report writing. I know you all love to write reports, and everyone loves to read our reports, right? Yeah, not so much. So we want to make sure that we are writing reports that are helpful and useful, and not just writing reports to check off the box that we got it done. It always feels good to get a report done, but it feels even better when somebody gives us feedback on a report to say, that was so helpful. I learned so much from that. I know what to do now. And that's what we really want to strive towards. So today in this segment, we're going to talk about reports in general as far as some key features that need to be considered. And then we'll also look at why we're doing the evaluation. What is the purpose of doing either an initial evaluation or a reevaluation? Some elements of good reports, and then we'll jump into making the information meaningful and talk also about writing recommendations if you choose to write recommendations. And I want to make the case that you should choose to write recommendations, knowing that you may be getting other guidance saying don't do it. So we'll talk about that as well. So starting with the report itself, Article 7 tells us that after we do an educational evaluation, then the M team has to write up a report. But what it says specifically is after an educational evaluation, then we have to compile it into an educational report. Okay, so let's think about what this means. That means that even though our M team, our multidisciplinary team, is made up of different people and we all may be assessing different things and contributing to it, there is one evaluation, right? It is one big evaluation with just lots of moving parts, and everything needs to be compiled into one report, which means there is no psychological report, educational report, occupational therapy report, speech and language report. These have to be synthesized into one report from this one mass evaluation. And I think we still have some districts who tend to operate very separately and have separate reports that people feel pretty strong ownership over. This was my part. This is my piece of the evaluation. It really needs to be all about the student. This is the student's evaluation and the student's educational evaluation report. It's also important that synthesis piece of compiling everything into the one evaluation report is on us. It's our job to tie it together for the reader. It's our job to tie it together for the parent, for the classroom teacher, for whoever needs to then take the results and know more about the student, more about what the findings mean, and more about what to do. So has to be one, and it has to be integrated. So I want to give credit on the next couple of slides to Dr. Leonellis, who developed these slides to share an understanding of why we do educational evaluations. So this shows us that the purpose of the evaluation itself is to provide information about either the student's disability that we know about or the disability that we suspect, and to give this information to the case conference committee. So we have a multidisciplinary team who is completing the evaluation, and then we have a case conference committee who may include some of those members, and actually have to include at least one of those members, that make the decisions. So this team is giving the information to the case conference committee in order for them to do two different things. Number one, to determine eligibility, to determine whether the student is eligible for special education and related services. And number two, if the student is found eligible, then the educational evaluation was designed to figure out the nature and extent of those services that the student might need in order to address that disability, to support them at school, to provide the necessary structure that they need. So as we look at the different prongs of purpose, it goes even deeper. So when we think about eligibility, we are asking the question, is there a disability? But we have to take it further. So our evaluation is not just about checking the boxes to say we did all the things that were required and we answered yes to these things and therefore the student is eligible. We have to go to the next level of saying, does this disability that we've said exists adversely affect educational performance? And we know that educational performance, as defined in Article 7, is talking about academic and or functional. So it's not just the academic piece, but we also have to consider the impact on functional performance as well. If that is the case, we take it one more step, or we should. We don't always, but we technically by law have to take it to one more level, which asks, does the student require specially designed instruction? Do they need special education and related services? Because we sometimes can say yes to, yes, there is a disability, yes, it's affecting their educational performance, but we may say in rare cases, no, the student does not need specially designed instruction, special education and related services. So 3 different levels of determining eligibility, and the student, you must be able to say yes to all 3 of those things in order to say truly yes to eligibility for special education. The second prong of that purpose of the educational evaluation is to look at the nature and extent of the services that are needed. So we need to think about things like the different types of services, the different supports, aids, accommodations, what it should be focused on. Our evaluation can generally tell us a lot about these things. They can guide us toward the right kind of services. Then it takes it to another level of saying, okay, now that we know what kind of services, how much do we need? What is the intensity or the delivery of these services that might be appropriate? To know how severe, how much impact a disability is having on the student's educational performance can tell us a lot about the appropriate dosage of those kinds of services. We don't treat everyone the same way. That's why this is an individualized education plan. That's why we do individual educational evaluations for the student. This is all very designed for each individual student and will tell us a lot more about what we need to do for the student. So as we look at the elements of a good report, again, we need to have information that tells us about eligibility, should guide us to some really good information about the student's present levels of performance. So beyond grades, grades tell us a little, but grades definitely do not tell us enough information to know what areas do we need to think about goals for the student, and how should those goals be designed? What is the starting point? So our information should be able to tell us not just the standard scores for an achievement test, but tell me what the student could and could not do. In the description, I've read so many wonderful descriptions of a write-up for an achievement evaluation that says, you know, this is what the student did really well with. These are the things that they missed sometimes. These are the things they could not do at all. That tells us a lot about what kinds of goals might be appropriate based on where we're starting from, so those present levels of performance. Areas of current need. they should generate directly from the evaluation. If they don't tell us about the student's current areas of need, they didn't give us all the information we needed from the evaluation. It should also derive possible accommodations and possible services. So when we design services, when we design accommodations in an IEP, it has to be based on something. We don't pick accommodations from the list that comes in the drop-down menu because they sound good or because we think that they might lead to higher scores on the iLearn test. We check them and design them because they are helping to mitigate some of the circumstances of a student's disability or some of the roadblocks that the disability puts up for the student. Things that interfere with participating in the general curriculum. It has to be based on something. So for example, if I'm going to check a possible accommodation for a student being extra time, I need to have a reason for that. It may be slow processing speed. That's going to take more time. It may be a motor difficulty that's causing the student to take longer to complete something just because of the motor issues. It could be because my attention is so poor that I'm going to need some extra time to get myself focused enough to complete a task. Could be because of increased anxiety. But there has to be a need that drives an accommodation. And so our report should really help to identify some of those possible supports that are needed to provide a good justification for that. We want to make sure that our reports are written in clear language, that they're brief and concise, and they're meaningful. So thinking about that clear language and the readability of our reports. Generally, for the general public, the guidelines are that our text should be written at approximately the 8th grade level or lower. And then for our populations that may have more difficulty with literacy skills, we want to think about 6th grade level or lower. We don't tend to write like that. I think for a lot of us, when we were first learning to write reports and probably being very heavily supervised and given feedback on those reports, we were always pushed to, increase the vocabulary and make things sound very psychologist or speech pathologist like, and we get to the point to where our reports tend to be written for other professionals in the same discipline, and that's not the intention. If you read a report from a clinical psychologist in an outside office, I sometimes read them and go, oh my goodness, I don't even understand what's going on in this report. So really think about gearing it for the people that you want to read your report, which are generally other teachers and the parent. So think about making sure that you don't use a flowery word just for the sake of it sounded good. Get rid of those heretofores and the whereases and words that tend to be confusing, such as psychological jargon, complex terms within our own disciplines, speech and language, occupational therapy. We have a lot of terms that get thrown around that we know what they mean, but they tend to be a little more medically oriented and can be confusing to the reader. Put those in plain English. Put those in terms that everyone can understand. Keep out the acronyms, or at least if you need to use acronyms, explain them the first time you use them so that it is clear. Use examples whenever you can to explain what a student actually had to do on a subtest, what they could and they couldn't do. Those examples can be very, very helpful to the parent and the teacher. And they can also really give that feel of, you did work with my student, you know who they are. It just gives some of the personalization that we need within the report. Really focus on the skills and the processes that you saw, not the tests. What you don't want is to have a report that gives a 2-paragraph description of the IQ test, and we don't want to glorify the test. That's not what this is about. This is about the student. So explaining what test you gave is important. Somebody else is going to want to know, what did you give? If I have to give another test, what do I need to avoid because you just gave this test? I mean, that part is important, but the judgment is left to the multidisciplinary team to decide what test you're going to give using your professional judgment. So you don't need to justify necessarily why you gave a test, give its history and background and the validity and all this kind of stuff, because nobody cares. Nobody's reading this. Just get to, how did the student do? What does it tell you about them? Be very purposeful in the types of scores that you're reporting. Summarize the information well. Many people, when they read our reports, if we get lucky enough to have the report be read by somebody, they're looking for those summary pieces. They just want to get to the tell me what it means rather than a lot of the details. Keep it short. The shorter your report is, the more likely somebody is going to take the time to read it. The longer it is, the more you get lost in the mire. Definitely make it meaningful. Again, just to get the report done and check off that I got this done, I got it done on time, woohoo, that's great. That's one little piece. But to have a report that somebody tells you, I got a lot from reading this. I got some great ideas. Thank you for putting this together. If you can link it to all of those things that we need, such as information about eligibility, make it very clear what the thoughts are of the multidisciplinary team. We're having to put that information in the notice of initial findings for all of our initial evaluations. It can be part of the report as well to really link it back to eligibility. Make it clear that you've done all the pieces and parts that were needed to satisfy Article 7 requirements. Link to those recommendations and have good reasons for those recommendations. Recommendations that just come out of a bank of things that we could do aren't as helpful as things that can be directly linked to the student had trouble with this and therefore I'm recommending this particular thing. Link to some possible supports as well. And think about some of the long-term outcomes. So especially for our students who are getting closer to transition age, or maybe already are within transition age, thinking about what they want to do. As you maybe collect some transition assessment information as part of your evaluation, thinking about what are some of the other long-term outcomes that the student has mentioned or the parent has mentioned. If we're shooting for a diploma, then what kind of supports can we put in place that will help the student continue on the pathway to getting their diploma? All the things in the report need to be there to support the student, the parent, and the team in making all these things happen. So all of these things that should be important and center around things that this group needs to have from the evaluation. Some other things that we can think about too are including information on rates of progress. So as we help to support the team in knowing the potential dosage of supports and services, so the intensity, the frequency of the different kinds of supports, if we look at the previous rate of progress for students, we'll know kind of what trajectory they're on, what kind of rate of progress have we seen in the past, and we know what kind of supports have been in place in the past. And so in order to make a difference in changing that trajectory, we want to think about increasing the dosage of those kinds of supports. So this can apply to our initial evaluations and our reevals. It can also apply when we have information from the intervention process if the student participated in RTI or multi-tiered system of support, and also for those non-intervention cases where we still may have some previous rates of progress either from classroom-based assessments or from district assessments, looking at progress over time on benchmarking kinds of assessments that we have. But if we don't look at the past history of how the student has performed under certain conditions with certain things in place, then we sometimes don't know what to change. And without thinking about that, we sometimes will see situations where a student was getting supports prior to the evaluation and maybe increasing levels of support, and then determining that the student needs to be evaluated, they may have been tested, qualified for services, and sometimes those supports are taken away and we replace them with special education. That can sometimes lead to a student getting less service after an evaluation than before, which doesn't make sense. If the student did not have a rate of progress that was positive, and then we suddenly reduce the amount of service, then naturally we would expect that the student's performance may even show a decline. So we have to be very mindful of these things, and if we can include any of this in our report, then it's going to help the team make a better decision when designing the appropriate services and supports for the student. It's also helpful to think about what is expected at a particular grade level and what some of the standards are as we design, interpret the test results and as we design the supports. So making sure that we have a good understanding of, if this is a 5th grade student, what are those 5th grade standards? That can help me to determine what kind of standards the student might tend to struggle with, might be expected to not meet unless we put some supports in place, difficulty with accessing the curriculum, what kind of accommodations or services might be helpful in helping the student get more access. So all of those things can really be important and can increase the utility of our reports. Recommendations tend to vary greatly around the state. I know there are some districts who discourage recommendations in a report, some who always include recommendations, and then other districts that it may vary from person to person. If you do include recommendations, and I tend to always include recommendations based on the findings, make sure that you're sticking to evidence-based practices. Don't suggest things that don't have a good background, that aren't likely to work. It's our obligation to give suggestions, if we're going to give them, of things that we think are likely to provide a good outcome for the student. Think about possible accommodations. Again, we don't want it left to a committee sitting around just looking at a list and trying to think of what looks good. If we can link directly from our findings to possible accommodations to help address different situations, we're going to have a better IEP. We can make recommendations for things that might include home support. Parents often want to know, how can I support this at home? Tell me something I can try, especially when we have students who perform differently in the home environment than they do in the school environment. What things work, what things might help mitigate some of the circumstances that a student might have at home. So some things that, again, these are recommendations, these are offers of suggestion, these are not things that people have to do. Including some recommendations that a student can do. We have a lot of students that, especially as they get older, need to advocate for themselves, need to help develop a skill set so that they can become more and more independent. I know there are educational diagnosticians out there who will sometimes meet with the student and go over recommendations with them about, let me explain how to do this. Let me explain what this would look like. Psychologists, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, lots of people out there who are meeting with students and talking about what is your part in this? How can you help your own learning, help your own behavior, any of those kinds of things. Never, never, never make a recommendation about placement. So we're not talking about eligibility, we're not talking about supports and services. We can make recommendations about those things, but do not put recommendations about a particular classroom, school, setting, anything like that in your report. That can be very problematic, and I would imagine most of your school attorneys will tell you the same thing of stay away from placement in any of your recommendations. And make sure that as an individual member of the multidisciplinary team are contributing to that pool of recommendations for a report, that you're staying within your competency area. So your competency really comes from your own training, your own background, and areas that you feel comfortable saying, I understand this recommendation, I understand its the effect that it can have, and I'm contributing this to the report. So we don't make recommendations about medication because unless you are a physician sitting on the team, then that is not within our background. There may be a recommendation in the report that says, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson may wish to take this report and share a copy with their physician. End of story, right? We're not talking about what the physician might do with that, because maybe we do think on a personal level or even on a professional level that this student might benefit from medication. It is a parent's decision. A school cannot keep a student out of school because they don't have their medication or the school feels like the student needs medication. But we can say, here's another copy of our report. Feel free to share this with your family doctor if you choose to. That's very different than saying the parent should take this and give it to their physician. That could be interpreted as, oh, we really think you need a doctor's visit, which could lead to the school paying for that visit. And schools don't want to do that. So stay in your lane. If you're ever in doubt about a recommendation you might be making, then talk it over with your director. Run it by them and see what they think, whether it could potentially get you into hot water or not. So some watch outs for your report. Think about the confidentiality and the dignity of the student and the family. So sometimes we may have information shared with us that is really interesting but not necessarily educationally relevant as part of the evaluation. I would just say if it's Jerry Springer material, it probably doesn't need to make its way into your report. Really think about the details that you may want to include or not include, and how educationally relevant is it for the student. Again, keeping excessive or misleading scores out of your reports can really simplify things and help it be more clear. Keep it short, because if it's too long, nobody will read it. Keep it simple enough to where don't write it to impress other people. If it's too complex, nobody will read it and nobody will understand it. And then also really work to personalize it, and don't have the information be too vague. Give specific examples, give specific information, be as clear as possible. Keep things on a very individualized level. Use the student's name. And if you're using the student's name, and maybe the student's name is Timothy, but they go by Tim or Timmy, then you're going to start your report by saying, this is Timothy's report, but in parentheses, go with whatever everyone is calling the student, and then use that name throughout the report. You know, we have a lot of students that go by their middle name, or everyone, including teachers and parents, call them a different name. You want this to be written to be very personal for that kid, and to just use a very formalized approach doesn't convey that. Giving some very personal examples of anecdotes from the evaluation process, something quirky that the kid did. Maybe, you know, I've written in reports before what kind of t-shirt a kid was wearing because it just really fit the kid's personality. You know, things that a parent can read the report and say, you actually do remember my child. You did work with them, you know, you hit the nail on the head with describing them. Those kinds of things can go a long way with building that relationship and establishing some trust for the meaning of what you found in the evaluation process. So I hope that really helps with I know we write good reports, we do. But if you can take the report that you write and just make it just a little bit clearer, a little bit shorter, a little bit more useful, then I think that's really what we're all striving for. And as an M Team member, we all contribute a part to that. So thank you for joining us for this session, and continue to visit the Padlet for educational diagnosticians and to be part of our series.